Looking at the cars that were running in this race, we had the Itala driven by Italians, we had the Didions driven by the French. The Spiker,
Yes.
odd choice, but there was a reason.
Yeah, so the Spiker was the Dutch automobile, and it was the Dutch entrant, but it was driven by a Frenchman who had approached the Spiker firm, which at that point was, was having a very tough time. So the Spiker firm, which was responsible, actually, sort of as a little bit of trivia, it's responsible for creating the golden coach that is used by the Dutch royal family. But anyway, they were an automobile firm started by two brothers. One of the brothers in 1907 had just died in a very horrific boat disaster, quite well-known boat disaster, and the firm is experiencing great financial difficulty. Charles Goddard, who is the French driver, approaches the Spiker firm and says, Le Matin have proposed this race. There's a great deal of prize money available to the winner. Would you be interested in loaning me the car? It would be publicity for your firm, and if I win, and I think I will, then there'll be this great deal of prize money for you. And so this seems like a potential way out of financial difficulty for the firm, but also I think Jacobo Spiker, who's the surviving brother, was probably just not in a very good place mentally, as we might say now, and probably wasn't making the best decisions, and so perhaps rather rashly gives a car to Charles Goddard, who's this Frenchman, without perhaps doing his due diligence into exactly who Goddard is and his qualifications and the kind of man that he is, and it almost immediately comes back to bite him, because it turns out that Charles Goddard is perhaps not is a bit of a rascal, to put it mildly, and perhaps not all. Perhaps not the man you would want to loan a car to.
And he did, and I think later on, when they kind of realised that, they sent a mechanic out, didn't they, to basically keep an eye on him.
To keep an eye on him. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things is, having been given this car before the race begins, Charles Goddard drives it to a local garage where you can procure a whole load of spare parts, which he then does, and sort of asks for spare tyres and fuel and all the bits and pieces that he'll need. And he says, "Can you please put it on the account? Can you please put it on the Spiker firm account?" He hasn't asked if he can do this. It's not legit at all, but he's got a Spiker car, and he manages to sweet talk them into giving him a whole load of spare tyres and everything else. And he can't afford his passage. He can't afford to get the car to China. So what does he do? He sells all the spare parts that he's just got on the Spiker account and buys himself a first-class ticket to go to China, and doesn't actually bother to pay for the car. He buys himself a first-class ticket. He puts the car in the hold and tells them he'll pay them at the other end. I mean, the chutzpah is something else.
He really is the Terry Thomas, isn't he? He's the sort of the grinning evil villain in a way. Yeah,
it's funny because I was really hoping when I started researching the book, he was the character I really wanted to find out more about, because he really treads that line. On the one hand, you actually really want him to win, because he's quite disreputable, but he has these moments of great heroism where he really goes above and beyond and does things that I don't believe that I would be capable of. He managed to save one of his teammates from almost certain death. Again, using his powers of persuasion, and I that is something that's incredible to me, and I don't know how he managed to do that in the moment, particularly when he wasn't feeling particularly well. So you root for him, but he's clearly disreputable and clearly a liar and clearly has a very strained relationship with the truth. And so I really wanted to find out more about that and to unpack that a little bit more and to let people make up their own minds, but also to really try and uncover the truth of it as far as I was going to be able centuries after the event.
Do you think that the heroism that he displayed, if you like, at certain points made the newspapers a little kinder to him and the people around him a little kinder to him than they otherwise would have been, because he almost got away with this the badness for years. It was in people's later years when they put their hands up to quite how naughty he was, shall we say.
So I think, this is really the power of, this is really where you see how self-interest works, because actually it was almost in everyone's interest to let the less savoury aspects of how he conducted himself, to let that slide and to not publicise it too much. So but his heroism definitely helped. It definitely helped earn him the loyalty of his, the person who travelled in the car with him, his life he saved. And so even when there were clearly glaring discrepancies, and there were moments when the person driving with him could have blown the whistle, he didn't, and he let the glaring discrepancies lie. And what I found really astonishing, and a lot of this stuff was taken at face value for many decades afterwards. In the books that are published in the 50s and 60s, they really helped to build a myth around some of these things. And yet one of the first things I did when I started researching this book is I plotted all the points that we could definitely be sure of. So all the points where we knew that a certain person had been when they sent a telegram, for example. The telegrams have a location on them, and that's published in the newspaper, and so you can sort of start to plot by date and location where people are. And looking at that, it becomes quite obvious that something is awry. When you start looking at the distances and the speeds and the days, it's very obvious that things don't add up, and that must have been obvious to people on the ground. And yet at no point does anyone sound the alarm or point this out, and it clearly benefited everyone to act as if the race had been conducted legitimately by everyone involved.
He's certainly an interesting character. Borghese in his own way, but I think Goddard is the total antithesis of this, and there really are some sort of caricatures in there.
Yes,
certainly worth listening to. The other thing I want to talk about, you have a chapter about horses, which obviously this is about what was known as the horseless carriage afterwards, but there were an awful lot of horses in cities. They were both subject to accidents and the instigator of many accidents, and they were really considered at some point. We had all this amount of, let's be honest, horse poo everywhere, so you had massive pollution. The motor car was seen as the answer to this, wasn't it? Here comes a nice clean little thing that just puffs out a bit of smoke and doesn't leave all this in the streets, and the logistics of collecting it and moving it out were so expensive.
So I think one thing that I felt was very important is that we now sort of take the horseless carriage age for granted, and we sort of accept that the cities and our landscape has been shaped by the car, and that feels very ordinary to us. And I felt it was very important to show why it was felt at the time that the car wasn't obvious, it wasn't inevitable, it wasn't, of course we're going to get rid of the horse and we're going to adopt the car, of course that makes sense. That wasn't the case in 1907. People didn't feel like that. People didn't feel like it was obvious that everyone was going to sell their horses and buy cars. And I wanted to explain how horse-powered cities and horse-powered industries worked on a practical level, and that includes things like what on earth do you do with the metric tons of horse shit that produced day in, day out in cities, and that included things like what mass transport looked like before you have the engine and when you're using horses. And I thought that was very important because, cities as they are now built around the car, in 1907 they were built around the horse. The road surfaces was one that was suited horses' hooves. You have, even as you get the development of a railway industry, you still need horses. In fact, you need even more horses because now there are more goods and more people pulling up in railway stations, and you need to get those goods and people the last few miles. And so you need even more horses in order to transport more goods. And so when you're looking at cities in 1907, they are powered by horses, and the horse industry is a huge has a huge vested interest in the continuation of the status quo. You know, you have millions of jobs dependent on horses, everything from vets to the people who make the carriages, to the people who make the tack, to the people who repair it, to the people who are, you know, looking after the horses on a day-to-day basis. Everything is built around the horse. You have these huge 4 or 5 story stable complexes that are run by Great Western Railway, who are, you know, and the horses are then, you know, used to transport goods, and there's this whole system built around the horse. And I felt I really wanted readers to know a little bit more about that, so they can realise just how cataclysmic a change it is when the car starts to replace the horse, and suddenly this massive edifice begins to crumble. And, you know, we now know that in a few short decades it will have disappeared completely, but it didn't feel that way then. It really felt like, you know, there would be a plurality, there might be different types of technology coexisting. You know, yes, the car might be used by the very wealthy, but you'll still get most people using a horse and cart, and that really felt the most obvious future. It didn't feel like you were about to see a complete sea change in technology.
Was there a conflict between, say, the horse owners and the car manufacturers? Did it spill out? And I suppose the other thing as well is, you know, you had a lot of cavalry regiments in those days. They were very reluctant to get rid of their horses. Even, I mean, the Uhlans were still using horses in World War II. So it clung on until it more or less just became a recreational thing. But there must have been some sort of economic clash.
You do get this idea that cars at that time aren't very reliable. You know, they needed an awful lot of assistance between Peking and Paris. And the fact that they needed so much assistance, that weighs against them in a military context, because, you know, battlefields are not made of glistening asphalt. They are, you know, muddy, they are very difficult to traverse. And, you know, just as cars struggled, you know, going through Siberia, inevitably they're going to struggle on a battlefield. And you do have also these very big entrenched interests that are, you know, vested in the continuation of the horse-powered world. So you do get this culture clash. You also have people feeling that the car is a symbol of entrenched wealth. And, you know, Woodrow Wilson, just before this race, accused car owners of spreading socialistic feeling, because he said, you know, when people see a car driving by, they are disgusted by the display of, you know, it's such an obvious display of conspicuous consumption. Cars are very expensive, the fuel is very expensive, the oil is very expensive. When you look at the kind of the prices of all the gear that a driver would have, from the coats to the gloves to the goggles, you know, everything, they are all, you know, luxury items. And so, you know, there's very much a feeling at the time that the car is not for people like us, it's for the very highest echelons of society.
But actually it worked out completely the opposite, didn't it? Because you had almost a democratization of transport. So for the first time, by the sort of end of the Second World War, you know, the average working man could own a car, could go on holiday, could go to days out, take his children all over the place. It became endemic in the population, and we accept all that freedom of movement we have with both the motor car and the modern aircraft now. It did lead to a major change. It did bring travel to the masses. How reluctant do you think the masses would be to go back to not travelling, because we now have these sort of, well, 15-minute cities and low travel zones and all the rest of it. It's people are going to start reacting against it, having had something up.
Absolutely. So, you know, in 1907, at this time, people, you know, ordinary people really hate the car. They see it as a menace. They see it as, you know, not for people like them, but for the, you know, for the ultra wealthy. They also see the car as encroaching on their way of life, because streets, particularly in cities, urban streets are seen as extensions of private homes. You get kind of very crowded inner city areas, and the streets are used by ordinary people, and particularly by children, as places to be sociable. You go for your evening walk, your children can play in the road. And suddenly the motor car comes along, it's going very fast, and you get huge numbers of accidents. And that is looked on with a lot of disfavour, of course, by ordinary people. And you get this real resistance to the car. And this, there are quite a lot of incidences of drivers being, stoned, having stones thrown at them, and being grabbed out of cars if they've caused an accident, and being, beaten up by ordinary people. There's a real tension. Because people are used to having access to the streets, and their way of life doesn't depend on the car. Fast forward to now, and the way that we've built our environment often means that people without a car are stranded. You don't have a shop within walking distance. You have to drive to it. And so you now have another situation where, again, people are coming along and saying, well, actually, maybe our way of life is going to change. Maybe we can't all have a car. Maybe we don't have the resources. Maybe fuel's going to be too expensive for the average person to be able to afford it. Maybe we need to think about not taking the car, or are we going to start penalising car users? And again, you're going to have massive resistance, because people's way of life has now a lot of people are now dependent on the car for their livelihood. You might not live very close to where you work. You might have to travel to get there. And because we've been such wholehearted adopters of the car, other forms of transport haven't perhaps had the attention that they deserve and haven't flourished. And you've now got to have a rebalancing. It seems to me what people need is the ability to get from A to B, and you can't throttle the car without providing an alternative, because simply the way that we have designed we've designed our environment, our built environment, and we've designed our lives around access to the car. If you suddenly whisk that away from people, what do they do?
Do you think there's sort of, at the moment, there appears to be, as there is in general society, and I think in America as well, there's this dichotomy, there's extremes. There's a point where something's got to meet in the middle there.
Yeah, and I also think it's very funny looking at 1907, a lot of the problems that we have now, people were already talking about them in 1907. They were very aware. They were very worried about being dependent on petrochemical-based fuel, for example. There'd already been fuel shocks. There'd already been fuel shortages and price spikes. And they were saying, this is not a good idea to be reliant on a fuel that is abundant in some parts of the world, but not everywhere. We really need to think about it. It seems like it's going to be a finite resource. That seems very silly to build a whole industry on a resource that is finite. What do we do? So they were already thinking about a lot of these questions in 1907, but events overtook them. Suddenly cars began being produced that were much cheaper. People began to really want them. They were these symbols of freedom and excitement and travel and adventure. And along came the First World War, and you just had to make do with what you had because you were on a war footing. And so a lot of these concerns that people had, and these ideas about, actually, is this practical for the future? Is this practical for the masses for the future? Those concerns and those niggles were thrust aside and were no longer front and centre. But I think if you spoke to someone who was the absolute really wanted to advocate for the car in 1907 and asked them what the ideal future would look like for drivers, they would envision one in which there were where driving was a real pleasure, where you didn't need to drive, but you could drive for pleasure. And that is not the world that we live in now. If you think about most people's driving experience, you think of traffic, you think of pollution, you think of rush hour. That's not an ideal driving setting. So almost by creating a world in the car's image, we've made the use of the car less enjoyable than perhaps people want it to be in 1907.
Yes, and I suppose back in 1907, a lot of families tended to live nearby, whereas now they can live several hundred miles apart, or quite often in different countries. So there is a need to travel, which probably didn't exist before.
Yeah, for sure. You would be visiting family in other places, but also your necessities. They were a lot. They were a lot more sort of evenly spread through communities. You didn't have people travelling for miles to a supermarket. You had shops on your doorstep. So there was less need to travel long distances because everything that you needed would be close by because that was just the reality of the way everyone lived. Whereas now that's not the way we live as much. And so, the design of our world has changed to reflect that.
The other thing that's changed is the first long distance journey was by Bertha Benz. And also, you then had the suffragette movement at the time. They actually had their own jiu-jitsu squad who were their bodyguards. So you had the birth of women's emancipation, and women here at Brooklands were racing cars on equal terms. It was a huge period of advancement for women's rights, wasn't it? It
was, and the idea of the car and the woman at this time is kind of a bit of a fraught one because, cars were just for the wealthy. So the people who were accessing them generally tended to be very wealthy women, as they were very wealthy men. But also you have this idea of cars as being a way of getting very far away from the home, of being a kind of an adventure vehicle, of allowing this freedom. And that is at odds with the idea of the woman at the time. You get this real sense that cars can take women very far from the home, very far from literally their sphere. And so that is quite uncomfortable. And you can see that reflected in newspaper accounts. So newspapers at the time absolutely loved reporting on female drivers having accidents. There was nothing they enjoyed more than talking about women having accidents. I very much doubt women were having more accidents than men, because there were very few female drivers, but there was nothing that the newspapers loved more than reporting accidents by women. And there was also this idea that the women who were driving cars were literally fast. There was this idea of kind of loose morals and freedom of movement, and you get this kind of this real tension. And yet the accounts of the actual women driving are very reflective of exactly the same emotions that men experience when they're driving at the time. So freedom, adventure. There's a wonderful quote which I put in the book by Edith Wharton, who talks about stealing upon a city unawares, that ability to kind of get in the car and find a new way into a place that is unexpected and that you can see from a kind of personal vantage point of a car. And it's just really illuminating to see these women's accounts of driving, of being drivers, of having agency. It is different. They are different to those of men, and they do talk about how visible they are and how much pushback they get from society. And particularly, there are some very funny, in hindsight, quotes from kind of American mayors who are saying the only machine a woman should be able to run is a sewing machine. One official tries to ban women drivers in the city. I think it's Cincinnati altogether at one point, and he fails. But you do get kind of resistance to the idea of women having this agency and freedom.
But when they did, it really started literally driving things forward, didn't it? In many countries.
Absolutely, that ability to move and that freedom, is really pivotal. But also, the ability of women to drive and the fact that so many women could drive becomes really important during the war, because suddenly you have men fighting, and you need people to drive the ambulances. You need people to be able to drive cars back on the home front. And so loads of women are driving and being active participants in the war as drivers.
And also flying, as we know, yeah. Let's talk about competition on the roads, and I don't mean in terms of racing, but we've got pedestrians, we've got cyclists, we've got motorists. There's an awful lot of clash at the moment, isn't there? I mean, we see the pelotons of middle-aged men in lycra, or mammals as they're called, rattling down, because there's a lot of disharmony between users. How do you think we might resolve some of that?
There's a really funny quote from Punch magazine in 1907 where they're basically poking fun at motorists, and the quote goes something, it's called, I think it's called the motorcrat, is the article. It's sort of a spoof, and it says, years ago cars were made, roads were made for me. Wise rulers were born and saw that in the future there would be motorists and that they needed to build roads for me. And so you get this this stupid spoof quote, and it's true. I think that motorists, particularly now, have the idea that roads were made for them and belong to them, and I think that was not true in 1907. Of course, roads were made for multiple different users, and I think we really need to make sure that that's understood now, that roads are not just for drivers and that other people shouldn't be allowed there, or don't belong on roads. I think that's very dangerous, and I think that it does cause a lot of aggravation. I think you need to have motorists understanding that they share the roadways with other road users and they need to behave accordingly, and that if something goes wrong, they are in the most powerful and dangerous vehicle, and therefore they should be the most liable. And I know that's not very popular, but I'm a driver and a cyclist in a city, and it's up to everyone to be responsible. If you are a cyclist, you owe it to pedestrians not to cycle out of control speeds and to obey the rules of the road. But as a motorist, you are in a really powerful, heavy vehicle, and if you tap a cyclist or if you tap a pedestrian, you are going to cause really serious damage. And I think people forget that. They think, I should be able to do whatever I want. It is that kind of that motorist mentality in a way.
Do we have the same problem with cyclists there? Just to be. Because they can be very, very arrogant. This is my road. Should people not just give a little here and there, do you think?
I think so, and I think it's up to everyone to get used to the fact that they share the road. And I think that is difficult for people, because I think you get this kind of like flexing of elbows, this kind of like, digging in. And actually, we all need to share the space. The roads are not just made for cyclists, they're not just made for drivers, they're not just made for the pedestrians. They are made for all of us to be able to get around. I think it's incumbent on drivers as the biggest, heaviest, most dangerous vehicles to be the most careful. But I don't think that you can cycle around like you own the road either, because you are still dangerous to to pedestrians if you're cycling fast. But also, we've all got to get around. You've got to be aware of other road users and respect them as well. I think the problem is I know that when I was, it was a long time since I did my theory. And so it's a long time since I looked at the way you're supposed to behave on the road with cyclists. And I think, for example, lots of drivers get very angry when cyclists, particularly when they're in a pack or a group, cycle two abreast and they can't get round. Well, actually, that's what you're meant to do as a cyclist. So I think there needs to be better education of what makes sense for each road user. And I think once you understand that there's a reason why cyclists might do that and why they are actually meant to do that, then I think that might change your perspective. But I also think there's been a big change. I remember my brother's a very keen cyclist, and so I started cycling with him quite early on, when there were fewer cyclists, and it's exploded again in popularity in the last few years. A lot more people are commuting to work on bike, and there are a lot of kind of more recreational cyclists, and so suddenly drivers are having to share the road with cyclists a lot more than they have since the 1900s when cycling was again very, very popular. And that is uncomfortable because you're not used to it, and we need to regain that sense of familiarity and regain that accommodation. But it is hard, because when you're in a car, you can drive a lot faster. Maybe not in a city where there are traffic lights everywhere, but you are capable of going a lot faster than the cyclist. And so it is frustrating when you've got a vehicle that is capable of doing these speeds and you're stuck behind a slow cyclist. Psychologically, particularly if you're late or something like that, it will drive you a little bit nuts. But it is up to us as road users and people in vehicles and people riding bikes to try and take account of the most vulnerable road users around, and to have them as your model and to think about them most. And it's psychologically quite difficult to do, we've all just got to get a bit better at it, particularly in cities where we're all on top of each other and where this problem isn't going away anytime soon. You know, you can't click your fingers and get rid of all the cyclists. You can't click your fingers and get rid of all the lorries or, you know, all the taxis or whatever. We've just got to get used to one another, and we can't just wish people away.
So let's go back a little bit and talk oil. Now, oil and then petrol were fundamental to the whole motor car industry. And there wasn't an oil industry before really the motor car came along as such. We didn't need petrol then. It's given rise to a whole economic blocks around the world. It's caused conflict. You can't actually go to war without petrol and diesel or the avgas these days. It changed the world immensely, didn't it? Just this fuel actually completely changed the economics and logistics around the world.
That's what's so interesting about this period, is that at the time, it isn't obvious that petrochemical fuels are going to be the winner of the kind of the car race, or the, you know. At the time, there are lots of different technologies. There are still steam cars, there's lots of electric vehicles on the roads, and then there's investigation into ethanol, alcohol-powered cars as well as fuel. And again, you have the First World War as a kind of real agent of determination, because you get the reality on the ground is that electric cars aren't viable in a war environment, and so people are just pumping out the car that works best in wartime, which is petrol. But if you think about it in 1907, and if you think about it now, then as now, most journeys are very, very short. And so actually electric vehicles work best in that scenario in cities. There's no reason why all cars need to run on one type of fuel. If you're thinking about powering the average commute for a person taking their kids to school is very different from the needs of someone who is transporting very heavy goods, or that's very different from someone living in the city to living in the country. All these needs might be best served by slightly different fuel types at slightly different times, and I find it quite curious in a way that we ended up settling on one fuel type for all these use cases.
But it looks like we're trying to go back to another fuel type. And what you're saying is mix and match, because things work for some people. Some people can, if they have a house with a driveway, they can charge their car if they live in a flat or a terraced house, and that would be completely impossible for them.
Yeah.
So we should have this mixture, really, shouldn't we? We shouldn't be getting rid of one thing just to replace it with another when it's not perhaps the best thing to go along with it.
It's really hard to sort of imagine what the best case future looks like for the car and for people and for transport. I feel like my guess would be that some sort of plurality. Maybe you don't have just individual car ownership, but you have kind of like car clubs where you're a subscriber to Audi, or you're a subscriber to Volkswagen, and there are Volkswagens, particularly in city for urban dwellers. You are able to take a Volkswagen that is local to your home, but you are subscriber to Volkswagen rather than owning a car. Maybe that's the future. And maybe if you are driving a very long way that day, you look for something that's petrol powered, or another type of fuel, hydrogen, or alcohol, or whatever it is that comes along. But if you're just doing a daily commute and it's only 10 minutes or 15 minutes, then you'd use electric. So I feel like the most sensible future is something where there is a plurality and where we think a little bit differently about car ownership, simply because if you look at space in cities, space is precious. And at the moment we spend an awful lot of space storing cars that are not used most of the time. Cars are, a lot of people, they might use them twice a day to commute, possibly, or they might only use them at weekends. And the rest of the time, you've just got cars sat stationary on the side of the road, taking up an awful lot of space. That doesn't really make sense in terms of, thinking about urban design and how we actually live. And so I hope that something comes along that is more reflective of just a sensible way to use space and a sensible way to use transport.
So we're going to bring those two extremes together in a compromise. Hopefully,
I think so, and I also think as a car driver, I think that would be a lot more pleasant driving experience.
Yeah.
But humans have never perhaps found the most sensible way of doing anything, so maybe that's a pipe dream.
And going back to racing, 1957 was the last Mille Miglia in a sense, in run in the proper way. We had 1907, we had the Peking-to-Paris race. The Mille Miglia finished, obviously, as we know, because of a number of deaths during that race, and racing on public roads rapidly either became illegal or fell out of fashion. But since then we've had the growth of these sort of posh regularity runs, and we're rerunning the the Peking-to-Paris, we're rerunning the Mille Miglia. What's your view on these recreations of these races? Is that something you like? Is that something you enjoy? Would you encourage that, or do you think that that's probably sort of a watered down version of the original?
I definitely think it's a watered down version. I think I have a lot of affection for the car. Maybe people reading the book and hearing me speak about the way in which we should accommodate cyclists won't feel that. But I have a lot of affection for the car. I was one of those people who, the moment I could get my provisional driving license, I did. I very much, was brought up in the country, and I very much saw being able to drive as a freedom. And I was very excited about being able to drive, and I still really enjoy driving, although, as I say, my daughter gets very car sick, and so that is putting a slight dampener on things at the moment. But hopefully, it's something that I can return to. I really enjoy it, and I would never begrudge anyone the ability to travel by car. And I think there are some places that are very difficult to reach in any other way, and those drives can be really magical. I think the problem is when you add speed and competition and crowded city streets. I think that's when accidents can and do happen. But I think that being alive is risky, and so you've got to, as with everything, you've got to sort of weigh up the risks. You shouldn't expose everyone to dangers unnecessarily. You've got to be realistic about the dangers, but you also can't wrap the whole world in cotton wool and pretend there's no danger to anything, because that's not how we live either. You've got to balance those needs, which is a very wishy-washy liberal way of saying I personally really love the idea that there are people doing the Peking-to-Paris rally now, and I would never want to deny them that pleasure, or rerunning the Mille Miglia. But also when you look at the footage from some of these awful car accidents, and actually one of the there were horrible accidents in Le Mans, and you see the carnage. You have to respect these things, as you have to respect vehicles as things that can cause an awful lot of damage when things go wrong, when there are lots of spectators, and when you're in a crowded arena.
And I think those accidents changed the way we look at things. Jackie Stewart, probably the main instigator of safety in Formula One back in the day, because drivers were dying at quite a rate, and suddenly we had things like safety harnesses, helmets, neck braces, airbags. I mean, Schumacher crashes at a unbelievable speed and ends up with a broken thigh at the time. It's quite an advance in safety. So we've had the bad bit, but it's also made the technology leap forward and change the way we deal with it, because people start to get obviously worried about the carnage. And the same happened, I believe, in American football. The reason the helmets and things came in is because parents didn't want to send their children to universities to play a game where they were getting killed. So it has sparked the opposite end, hasn't it? It has made safety a bigger issue.
It has, but I think you also see the resistance to safety. I think that's something that comes up in the book and that is really surprising, is that you get real resistance to safety measures. Very sensible safety measures like seatbelts. There's real cultural resistance to them, people feeling that their rights are being trampled on by being made to do these things. And I think that is something that I find very surprising as a I think I'm technically an elder millennial, child of the 80s. I can't really remember a time before seatbelts, and it seems mad to me now that people would be like, oh, being forced to wear seatbelts, what a bummer. I find that very surprising, in the same way that now I look back on time before the smoking ban, which came in midway through I was university, and I can't really quite remember why going into a club and it being absolutely brimful of smoke and being like, oh, what a good night out, is exactly what I want to be breathing in. So I do think there is that kind of cultural resistance to safety changes as well, where people don't want to be told what to do. People don't want to be there's almost a freedom to have accidents. You want that freedom to life to be as dangerous as possible, and people resist.
It's almost a way of getting people to make their own choices, isn't it? If they could, if you can sort of choose.
But we don't always. I think that's the point, is that you don't always choose the most sensible thing. People don't necessarily act in their own best interests because they don't want to be told what to do by a kind of nanny state. And so that's a really interesting dynamic where people resist safety features that really have very little negative impact on them, but can have a great benefit. And yet, for some reason, people don't want to be told what to do.
I mean, that 3-point harness was invented by Volvo, I believe, and they didn't claim a patent on it because they wanted it to be universal. I think it's quite an amazing thing to actually give to the world.
But it takes a long time for some of these things, even if they're invented, very early on, like indicators, for example, are invented very early on, and they make total sense, and yet it takes a long time for them to be installed in every single car. And regular safety features like airbags and so on and so forth, they do take quite a long time. And you get scandals really where it's shown that car companies know that various bits of their vehicles aren't that safe and have been quite reluctant to do anything about them because they see a kind of commercial advantage to selling the customer what they want, and sometimes what the customer wants is a car that actually is quite dangerous and has giant fins that can pierce pedestrians, and it takes sort of a scandal, a very public scandal or a very public accident to change the dynamic and to bring a law into effect that then forces change.
Well, we've come a long way since 1907, and you've come a long way since writing this book. What's next on your list? What's your next book?
So I've just written a pitch for a book that I'm very excited about. I don't want to be too coy because it's annoying, but I've had an idea for a book. I've just submitted a pitch, and I'm waiting to hear back from my publishers. But it's a slightly different topic. It's in the realm of sports. And it's another history book. I'm also working on a podcast project that will hopefully launch at the end of March that's about blue plaques. It's called the Blue Plaque Pod, and I'm going to be speaking to interesting guests about a blue plaque of their choice. And we're going to discuss the personal thing that's commemorated, and why they matter to the person I'm speaking to. So that's my sort of next project, and then I've got this book that we'll see how the publishers take it, but yeah, exciting things on the horizon.
Well, I think it will be, because you've come at, as we said at the beginning, you've come at this subject and this book from not the usual angle. You're not one of the usual suspects in motoring writing, and written what is a very, very interesting book with a lot of background, history and politics behind it. So what I would say to people who are listening to this and watching this is that you need to go out to buy this book, The Race to the Future by Kassia, who's been our guest today. And thank you very much for coming along today and telling us all about it.
I fully endorse the message of buying the book. Please.
Available from all the usual outlets, and presumably all the usual online outlets as well. And we'll try and get our director here to put a link below, so
Fantastic.
it should help people out. Thank you very much, Kassia,
Thank you very
for
much
your
for
time.
having me. Thank you.
Pleasure.